couldn't use anymore.
Good evening, and welcome to, I guess, the second in a series now of talks by Michael Sullivan about Tacoma as an immigrant city. And before I introduce Michael, I would also like to thank Tacoma Creates, who has helped fund this, and also McMenamins, who has given us a great venue and a place to have this. But first, I guess I can say a couple things about Michael Sullivan. I think probably a lot of you already know who he is because we get such a great turnout when we have an event where he's speaking. I guess they don't have historian laureates, but if Tacoma had one, it should probably be Michael Sullivan. He created the Tacoma History website. He's been teaching at University of Washington Tacoma for about 20 years now, teaching Northwest history. And he's active in a number of boards trying to promote history preservation. And I think immigration, for reasons we'll talk about, is something that's just kind of weaving in with the identity of Tacoma. And so please join me in welcoming Michael Sullivan to tell us about Tacoma and Immigrant City.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. Well, I want to start just by saying I had invited my good friend Robert Satiacum to come tonight and to start tonight with Robert telling a story. Another good friend of mine, Nick Blaine, and I did a documentary film this year. And Robert started the film with one of his amazing stories. The Satiacum family are well known in the Puyallup tribe, and Robert is just a wonderful storyteller. But both Robert and his wife, who's now in the hospital, got very sick, and so Robert had to duck out. Next year, if we do this again, I promise you I'll have a wonderful story. But just to kind of go into my mind on why, in particular, I wanted to have Robert tell a story. First of all, it's only appropriate that we recognize we're here on the traditional lands of the Puyallup and the Salish people who have been here for, hundreds of generations on this land and have been caretakers of our world, our natural world, and we should all try to do as well as they've done over these thousands of years. And Robert, in his inimitable way, seems to find a story of great generosity and a revealing story about the way the Puyallup people in particular, as caretakers of a natural harbor, have a welcoming nature. And you can't talk about immigration without recognizing the people that were here first and were welcoming in being here. So as that sort of framework put down, I can't do it as well as Robert would, but anyway, I just wanted to start with that. Last year I kind of did a wide kind of look at immigration in general over the 150 odd years that immigrants have been coming here from around the world. Claire Petrich, who asked me to come back again this year, I thought this year I'd like to look at our city in a way that we don't see it today, and yet for most of our history it's been the elemental way that we think about Tacoma. We are a seaport, and the automobile and airplanes and freeways and all that stuff have somehow got us to a point where we don't think about this as being a port city. We think of ourselves as a port city. For most of our history, though, most people coming here, maybe not most, but a good share of the people coming here first see our city from the water. And for hundreds of years, people traveled around our part of the world using the natural waterways. We are a city with a maritime DNA fixed in ourselves. And so I wanted to talk this year from the standpoint of how marine and maritime sort of arrival has been the way that our city has grown and the kind of shape that we've taken that's very much still with us, that form that we've been given by the fact that we are a port city and that people coming here come by water and they travel by water and they commute, they have an understanding, that sort of maritime face of the city, if you will. I also this year really wanted to talk about the most formative period in the city. And you know, we don't think about this when somebody from the East Coast looks at us and thinks don't have any history here. It's worth noting that we got not only the native history that goes back 15,000 years, where there have been people living here, but after 150 years, we are an elder city in the American West. And so it's worth thinking about that aspect of us. We are not Bellevue or some suburban city, some post-war city. We are a city where our beginnings come with after the American Civil War, with the arrival of the railroad, and with ships coming even before the railroad arrived. So I wanted to talk about that, but also it's really, in many ways, one of the most interesting formative periods in our history come in the first quarter of the 20th century. So I kind of wanted to focus on that because most of the people coming here were waterborne. They were coming by sea. And we are a city where more than 3/4 of our city limits are formed by saltwater shoreline. So think about that for a second. And by the mid-1920s, other incorporated cities, the straight lines of city limits from other cities, had pretty well defined the acreage of Tacoma. So what I want to talk about tonight is just how people arrived to that 3/4 of the city limits that are saltwater, and how we took shape by the time we were corralled in by the cities that surround us. So in geographical terms, in terms of the geography of our city, we kind of take shape, our final shape really comes into focus by about 1925. The other interesting thing is that by 1900, by the turn of the century, we had hit about 35,000 people. In that first quarter of a century, we were going to triple in size, the fastest 25 years of growth in our history. And we went from 35,000 to 100,000 people by the mid-20s. It took us almost a century to grow in population that second 100,000 people. So in 25 years, we grew to 100,000, and in 100 years, or 90 years, we got to 200,000. So that incredibly intense, compressed growth of people coming here all happens really in that first quarter of the 20th century. And the fact that we're a seaport is the big reasoning for those people coming here. It's the charm, it's the lure, it's the elemental part of the city when somebody in Eastern Europe or in Manchuria on the Asian coast look at a map and say, I want to go there. So anyway, that's what this first slide is about. This is fascinating. By 1910, when you picked up the daily newspaper and you flipped to the second page, the headline was, the banner on the second page was always marine news. What ships are coming and going, what goods are coming and going, what jobs, what activity is happening. We were getting, in that early part, we were getting a lot of our mail and a lot of just commerce that came and went with the shipping lines, and we were getting immigration big time. A considerable amount of the traffic coming into our port was into our passenger docks. And we had sometimes 8 and 10 passenger ships a week coming into Tacoma, and you could buy a ticket and go all the way around the world from Tacoma, leave from here and arrive here and do the whole thing by sea. So we were that important of a port. So I wanted to talk about particularly some sort of, I love backstory, and I hate the idea of just kind of talking about immigration or just human experience in big mass just by a stereotypical, cataloging by race or where people came from. Where you always have to get down to the journey story of individuals and then project out from that, rather than look at statistics and just say, okay, everybody from all Asian people, came along a certain route and arrived here in a certain way. Individuals coming here, the people that make up the city that we love and where we live today, each have individual journey stories that are handed down through the generations, and it makes up the history of families and all the people that make up what we are today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, narrow it down a little bit, probably mention some individual people along the way, thinking about them as, I hate the word typical, but sort of typical of what the experience was for people that set out from one place on the earth and decided to move their lives, their family, and their future, and their fate to Tacoma, Washington. So, I wanted to start with, I want to talk about ships and water and navigation and maritime, but the completion of the railroad coming by land, reaching the Pacific Ocean was in a way the launch of a whole new time in terms of marine trade along the Pacific Rim. And Tacoma suddenly, because we were a terminal for the railroad, became an instant port city. We became as important as Canton or Kyoto or Shanghai in terms of a destination showing up on charts for trade vessels and passenger vessels, starting in at the end of the 19th century, immediately. And that was because the railroads, as they got out here, built their own steamship lines. Once they got to the Pacific, there was money to be made in taking freight and people on to Alaska or to the Philippines or on to Asia. And so the first big steamship lines were built with capital that came from the railroads, the investment in the railroads. Well, Tacoma was where the Northern Pacific, the first northern transcontinental railroad to reach the Pacific, came to Commencement Bay in 1873. And not surprisingly, they launched the Northern Pacific Steamship Line, and that made us a port city right away. It's where the rails met the sails. So we took off. What was happening in the world by the 1880s, 1890s was, especially in Asia, where a lot of political turmoil and things that were beginning to be the launch, the sort of fuel for immigration once you could actually get to the west coast of the United States, and you could go the other way on the train back to Chicago or the East Coast or whatever, immigration started to be something that was attractive for people living in the Orient, in the Pacific Rim. And so that became an instant lure, and right away the Northern Pacific was more than happy to sell tickets. A lot of that had to do with immigration. Eventually it would evolve into tourism, and you'd have the steamship lines would be taking people that were traveling by, for tourism, for travel. Just to go back just for a second, and I want to focus for a little while here just on Japan, because it's so central to Tacoma. And you always hear about 1885 and the removal of the Chinese from Tacoma. What often gets overlooked is not long after that, we started to have immigration back into the city, mostly Japanese coming in. And it was because so many of the big money kind of produce that the railroads wanted to carry was tea and silk. And the big merchants in tea and silk were coming from Japan. So the MP wanted to have that product come into Tacoma. The sailors and the staff on the steamship lines quickly, the Japanese maritimers became a big part of the workforce in the steamship operation. So we started to have able-bodied seamen that were coming to the port, not necessarily to immigrate, but were coming here to work, were on board the ships. They were coal stokers and firemen that worked in the steamships, driving the ships, and above deck workers as well. Well, because Tacoma was a destination port and it took a while to offload and re-coal the steamships, we started to have Japanese opening hotels and overnight stay for seamen that were Japanese coming over, typical food, that kind of thing. So by the 1880s, 1890s, we were starting to see quite a large number of Japanese sailors who were coming in here. You probably know that right kind of after the Civil War, Japan went through a big turmoil. It's called the Meiji Restoration. And basically the samurai warriors were cast aside. The government chose a more kind of a representative form of government, although it still had an emperor. And they started to open up Japan to trade for people coming in. And they began to build their fleets to be able to be steam merchants themselves and started to go out. Tacoma, San Francisco, Vancouver were the three main ports in the very beginning, and they remained so all the way through the early part of the 20th century, all the way really up until Second World War begins. Those are the three big kind of ports. Tacoma, Seattle. Keep leaving that other city out sometimes. Anyway, a lot of stuff is going on, and this is a World Affairs Council, so you're going to get a little bit of world history because it helps to understand how involved the growth of our city was in some pretty tumultuous, huge things going on in the world at that time. So by 1900, Japan had already gone to war with China and had won. And by 1902, Japan was going to war with Russia that had built the Trans-Siberian Railroad and was in Manchuria and kind of wanted to grow the Russian Empire into Japan and into Asia, into the Asian coast. They built a seaport at Vladivostok, and they were starting to pressure the Japanese at this time. In 1902, the Russians kind of made a big push towards Japan, and Japan decided to fight back, to push back. And by about 1903, 1904, war broke out between Japan and Russia. And the war was largely fought as a naval war. And this is a big deal. The battles, the land battles between Russia and Japan at this time are some of the biggest land battles fought before the Second World War. I mean, there was 500,000 people involved in one of the battles between the Russians. But by 1904, 1905, the Japanese had built their maritime capacity so much that they met the Russians. The Russian brought the Atlantic fleet. It took them 18 months to bring steamships all the way into the theater around Japan to challenge the Japanese. And in a battle in 1904, the Japanese sank, basically, the Russian fleet. This is not the Russian Pacific Fleet. This is the entire Russian fleet. It's wiped out by the Japanese. That was a really, really big deal. And we're talking about before the Russian Revolution, before the First World War, all that. But it signaled that the Japanese were a major maritime power. And into this whole thing comes America. We get drug into this because the settlement of a treaty between Russia and Japan, they needed an intermediary, somebody to step in. At that time, Teddy Roosevelt, the American president, was the best candidate. Neither side trusted any European or Asian judge. And so Teddy Roosevelt stepped in 1905, developed a treaty between the two and ended the war. Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for that settlement of the Japanese-Russian war, conflict. But it also leaked out that Teddy Roosevelt really had an inclination, had a favorable attitude towards the growth of Japan in general. A lot of the Europeans, especially the Russians, felt that he favored the Japanese in the whole thing. Well, it turns out Teddy Roosevelt had another favorite thing, and that was Tacoma. He had been here in 1903, spoke at Wright Park, came back in 1911, that's later on in the whole episode. But he, as you probably know, he really had a favorable attitude towards the Pacific Ocean, very Pacific looking, and also developing our own army, our own navy, the Great White Fleet that he would do. So after the settlement of the war between Russia and Japan, Roosevelt, in conversations without any paperwork or without any treaties, met with the emperor in Japan and reached what's called the Gentleman's Agreement. I'm sorry I'm going on so long about this, but it's got such a great payoff. The Gentleman's Agreement basically said, unlike with the Chinese that were, once the Chinese were kind of used up as labor, they were just cast off. Roosevelt believed that Japanese, he didn't want to see a repeat of that. The Gentleman's Agreement, no written treaty, just a Gentleman's Agreement, basically said that for the Japanese who had already come over here, they would be allowed to stay. Japanese families or relatives would be able to immigrate with them. But Japan had to hold back on allowing laborers, male, single men laborers, uneducated laborers to come over. They were pejoratively referred to as coolies. But the idea of laborers coming over just to take jobs, if the government would not let that happen, the United States would basically welcome Japanese students, diplomats, teachers, intellectuals, commercial interests, women and children and families would all be able to immigrate, would be able to come to the United States. By this time, a big steamship line that was Japanese-based that was the equivalent in size to the Northern Pacific Railroad, the OSK line, built a terminal in Tacoma at the same time in 1906, 1907, the time of the Gentleman's Agreement. And this opened the doors to immigration into Seattle, Tacoma, Vancouver, and San Francisco. And Tacoma grew proportionally, we grew faster than any of those other cities in terms of our Japanese community here in Tacoma. So we had large immigration coming into Tacoma from Japan. By 1910, there were about 2,000 Japanese living in the downtown in the Nihonmachi, the Japantown. And there were another 2,000 people, largely Japanese, who were living in the Issei, first-generation immigrants, living in the Fife Valley. Farmers, for the most part, in the Fife Valley. Hotel operators, merchants, business people living in Nihonmachi in downtown Tacoma. This is a map that shows all those little names on there are businesses that are Japanese owned by 1920. That's Union Station is the sort of pagoda at the top, and the lower left you can see the office of the OSK steamship line on the lower left. And all those businesses, this was our commercial Japantown. Japanese business people here, a big part of the business of the 2,000 people that lived here were running hotels that were boardings for Japanese who were working in jobs in the woods, but especially visiting Japanese who were here because of maritime-related business. They worked on ships, they were translators, they were bookkeepers who came and went, and they would keep a mailbox at their hotel. There's over 20 hotels here. So 2,000 residents living in Tacoma at a time when our total population was probably still maybe 60,000 people, 60, 70,000 people in the city. 2,000 residents living in Japantown, another 500 or so living out in the port area by the shipping lines, and then probably another floating population of another 2,000 who were staying in hotels that were travelers, business people, adventurers who were coming and going. So it was a thriving part of the downtown, all the way from about 1905, 1907, when the Gentleman's Agreement takes effect, all the way up into really the neighborhood thrives all the way up until Pearl Harbor and internment in 1941. The picture in the lower right is the Moriguchi family. That little boy in there is Tomio Moriguchi, who I've had the great pleasure of meeting. He's the elder of the Ujimaya family. The Moriguchi started Ujimaya, which was a fish cake operation on Broadway in downtown Tacoma. And that's where Ujimaya started. And eventually, after internment, they came back to Seattle rather than coming back to Tacoma. In fact, Tacoma's we were the only city really that had a substantial Japanese population that had immigrated here. Not only was it Issei, but now there were Nisei, second-generation American-born citizens in most of the families that when internment came after Pearl Harbor, they left. And really, all the shops were taken over. We'll talk about this. It's a sad aspect of the whole thing, but we largely did not have our Japanese community come back. There was nothing to come back to. The property had all pretty much been seized. Harry P. Kane, who was our mayor at that time, was the only mayor on the West Coast who actually opposed the internment of the Japanese. And as it turned out, when FDR announced the executive order interning the Japanese, Eleanor Roosevelt was in Tacoma. And so we have great pictures of her, and as you probably, maybe you don't know, but Eleanor Roosevelt opposed the internment the Executive Order 9066 that interned the Japanese. So not only was Tacoma the only mayor, the only governmentally opposed city that was affected by internment, but we also had Eleanor Roosevelt on our side, but it didn't work out. So the reality was, for families that immigrated here from Japan, reality was they were able to bring families here, and so the population was growing rapidly. And as you can see from all the pictures here, kids were absolute, that was the purpose of life for adults who immigrated to the United States. And this Nisei generation, even though they didn't come back to Tacoma, they had a major influence on the development of our part of the world, our economy, and our just the diversity of the city that we are today. There's no excuse for the removal of the Chinese in 1885. Even though it was mob-driven, mob mentality. But the real heartbreaking tragedy in terms of ethnic injustice for Tacoma is not the 200, 250 Chinese who were removed in 1885. It's the 2,000 Japanese in 1941 who literally marched across the street onto trains at Union Station and were removed to Tule Lake in California at the beginning of the Second World War. So anyway, I'm skipping over, and in the future I'd like to be able to focus more. The Teddy Roosevelt connection, of course, brings us to the Spanish-American War and our relationship with the Philippines and immigration that comes from the Philippines too at the beginning of the century. But I just don't have time today to cover that. And then I was talking to Patsy O'Connell about the Korean immigration too, which is very important to the city, but that really comes after the Second World War. And so I don't mean to slight any of the other brave immigrants who leave behind nations in the rest of Asia. It's just we're limited in time. So the same thing is true in terms of looking the other way at immigration. We also, at the beginning of the century, beginning of the 20th century, had some pretty dramatic journey stories associated with newcomers to Tacoma from Europe. And in this case, you think, well, they must have come by sea and land. Well, that's partly true, but a lot of European immigrants to Tacoma actually came all the way around through the Indian Ocean, all the way. Many of the Greeks and Mediterranean immigrants came through the Suez Canal, through the Indian Ocean, and all the way to Tacoma across the Pacific. But I wanted to just talk about a couple of, and the Scandinavian immigrants who are coming here, same thing, except they're mostly traveling across the Atlantic and then coming by rail all the way across. We'll have to talk about the Scandinavians another time, but one element about being a seaport is that the vast majority of immigrants, regardless of where they came from around the world, tended to come from other seaport and other maritime communities. In picking a place on the map to travel to move to, people who lived in the trades, they were fishermen or boat builders or longshoremen or somehow worked on the water, they tended to be the ones that chose Tacoma. And a big share of the immigrants coming to our city, one way or another, had trades or had skills or had affections that were associated with saltwater, with the ocean, with the seaport, the romance of a seaport. I think there's a political aspect to this too, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, we'll get to this, but I have a theory that, I think Napoleon said something about this at one time, that if you want to be a tyrant, the place not to pick is a seaport. Because there's no way to control not just the flow of language and ships and goods, but the coming and going of ideas. There has to be a tolerance in seaports or you're out of business. If you're intolerant and you're a walled place, you know, your whole purpose in being is not going to succeed if there is that constant ebb and flow, the coming and going of ships and trade and people and goods and money, all those things. So I think for some people who were looking around their world at the time, looking at the changes in the world they were in, looking at a point in time where it seemed like the forces around you in your homeland are turning for the worst, and it's time to leave. Those people in that circumstance started to look at, well, where can we go to? Where do you want to go? Where can we completely escape whatever it is that seems such misfortune? And that's why I think Tacoma kind of gets picked, and we start to have folks coming that way. I wanted to talk a little bit at the turn of the 20th century again at Central Europe and especially Mediterranean Europe, because Tacoma has a big, important immigration that starts by about 1910. We start to have a following of folks coming out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in those early days. By 1910, getting into European history for a little bit here, the forces of the old emperors and kings and serfs and all that stuff had completely already proved to be a failure. You know, there was still a king in England, and there was still a czar in Russia, and there was still an emperor in Austro-Hungary. But, you know, it wasn't working. The days were numbered for that whole thing. And one way or another, the whole thing was going to break. While the politics and the clouds of war are starting to form a little bit, maritime industries are starting to really blossom, are really starting to take hold, and not just carrying mail, but carrying people. And in Europe, the British, the Cunard and the White Star passenger liners, in Germany, the Havard steamship lines are starting to realize that they could build big ships with a couple hundred cabins for the rich in first class, 400 or 500 cabins in second and third class for the not so rich, but still pretty rich, and then bunk beds for steerage that could take 1,000 people at a time. And they can start to market those. And as the turmoil in Europe is starting to happen, as really the beginnings of what would become the First World War start to take shape, that building of big passenger liners that can come across the Atlantic and be sponsored by people like J.P. Morgan who owned railroads, they could start to, in whatever the home language is, they could send a brochure and say, we'll give you passage from your homeland in Europe all the way across the Atlantic, and then by train all the way to the Pacific coast for, sounds ridiculous, but about $10 by 1910. Now, $10 is a lot more money in those days than it is today, but it still was within reach of people who were starting to feel like there was grim things in the future. As the pressure began to grow to build armies in Central Europe, and they began to use the draft, families pooled money to send family members to America. And in those countries and those regions where there were maritime trades, those folks tended to, especially in the Mediterranean, tended to look to the far American West Coast. East Coast was already getting crowded. New York, all those places were too expensive. It just wasn't working. Let's pool our money and take the long shot and go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. What's happening as we start to get into the First World War is Britain, France, and Russia are starting to team up to go against the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the middle, and the Germans in the middle, and the Italians aren't sure where they're going, and Spain is kind of out of it. So, but those countries that are sizing each other up for war by 1910, before the Archduke gets killed in 1914, are starting to really pour money into immigration. And the big steamship lines are making it possible. Talking about, in a 10-year period, millions of people coming by boat to North America, millions of people moving. For people living in the Pale of settlement in Russian territory, where pogroms against Jews and Muslims is just horrible, they're pooling their money and trying to bring whole families over. So we're seeing really large populations. A lot of them only get as far as the East Coast, but some nations where they've got shorelines, where there are fishermen and boat builders and people that are maritime trades, they find the way to be able to go ahead and take the train as well as the boat and be able to get to the West Coast. What's really interesting for us here is that Tacoma early on, Tacoma, Seattle, and Anacortes kind of got targeted by Croatian, the Dalmatian coast, which is the Aegean Sea, kind of behind. You can kind of see it. It's that indent behind Italy there. Well, I've highlighted the Croatia right there in red. Croatians in particular choose to skip the entire East Coast and come all the way out to the West Coast. And starting about 1910, but really by 1920, Tacoma really becomes a destination for Croatian Dalmatian fishermen and boat builders. And families like Petrich and Scansey and Martinac, all these names we recognize that are boat building operations, realize that inexpensive, beautiful material for building boats, conifer wood is perfect. It's lightweight, it's durable, it's buoyant, and it's abundant and cheap. So a family could stake a family member, Croatian family member, to come out, get a job on a purse seiner for a few years, be able to get enough money together to build a small boatyard like the Scanseys did at Big Harbor, and be able to build more purse seiners as combustion engines come along and purse seining becomes much more efficient, and salmon becomes much more profitable as a product. Our Croatian population really grows a lot. Slavonian, that whole area of Central Europe, or North Mediterranean. There's Slavonian Hall, which is still down in Old Town. You probably all recognize that, but anyway, still there today. These are benevolent. This is a benevolent club, and I love the way these work because every ethnic group, and today you can kind of trace the neighborhoods. Two ways to trace ethnic neighborhoods in Tacoma and any city, Chicago or anywhere: churches and benevolent clubs. Communities tended to gather around them. It meant churches meant that faith and language and just association, weddings, family events, all that stuff are kind of circled around that church, that religious belief. And the benevolent organizations meant that because households usually had one breadwinner, the dad would be the working one, mom would stay home, and they'd raise the kids. If dad, before, workman's comp, if dad got hurt, or God forbid he got killed or lost at sea, the family could be wiped out. Benevolent clubs, you pay your dues like everybody else, you have your parties and events and stuff, but if anything goes wrong, it's an insurance policy for the family. It formalizes the sense of community that keeps families together. And these benevolent clubs, Normanna Hall up on MLK, Slavonian Hall, we've got them scattered all over the city, and they mark these ethnic neighborhoods around the city. Our Croatian community really developed around Old Town, where Old Town is today. That neighborhood was largely shaped by our Slavonian or Croatian community. And then, of course, Gig Harbor really kind of takes off as well. Anyway, I'm starting to feel like I'm running too long, so I'm going to pick it up just a little bit here. I wanted to talk about one, and I'm almost done. I'm going to just want to talk about one last neighborhood, in this case, a lost neighborhood. The Hawthorne neighborhood, when the third transcontinental railroad came to Tacoma and set it up as a terminus in 1909, this was the Milwaukee Road, the last of the big three railroads. They also connected with a steamship line, and they built a terminal for passenger ships coming in. This was the Milwaukee Road terminal. And by 1910, they built that. At the same time the terminal got built, Puyallup Avenue was developed into a full paved roadway. Then the picture in the lower right here is Puyallup Avenue. This is much later, 1927. Actually, in 1910, this avenue, here it is in the the view right above it, in 1910 actually had a streetcar running on it. So where we are here is, you kind of see from the picture, if you're standing on McKinley Hill and you're looking down on the port, Puyallup Avenue, which is still there today, I think you probably know where Puyallup Avenue cuts. On the north side of Puyallup Avenue was the passenger terminal, and right where the light rail line comes in now is where the Milwaukee Road's passenger terminal was for rail. So you came in on rail there, but then if you were going out by ship, you crossed Puyallup Avenue and went out, and that you can kind of see there on the left how close they are to the port area. On the south side of Puyallup Avenue, it developed as a neighborhood. And this in many ways is the most interesting neighborhood in the city. The eastern edge of the Hawthorne neighborhood was the Puyallup territorial, or the Puyallup tribal lands, tribal offices, hospital, Indian school was all on that side. On the east side, the road, it was flat for a while, but then it went up the McKinley Park, McKinley Hill, where I think we all know where McKinley is today. But anyway, that park came down steeply, and in that neighborhood were wood frame houses. You can kind of get a sense from this bigger picture about how many houses there were. This was the last residential neighborhood. By 1920, they still didn't have paved streets and streetlights. So it was kind of a rough, scrabble neighborhood. It was right across the tracks, but it was where the longshoremen, the maritime trades workers, was also ethnically was the most mixed neighborhood in the city. Several families that had tribal members that were mixed families. We had Hawaiian, Samoan families living in that neighborhood as early as 1910. We had, well, St. Peter and Paul Church was Catholic Polish church. I think they still do Mass in Polish there on Sundays, was in that neighborhood as well. The school at the top is the Hawthorne School. That's what the neighborhood was named after, and you get a feel for all the kids. If you could see this picture a little closer, you'd see quite a bit of diversity in all these kids. It was the only school in Tacoma, 1910 up to 1920, that still had native kids, tribal member kids, could go to public school if they went to Hawthorne, so they didn't have to go to the Indian schools. And the big Indian school in Tacoma, there were two of them. Both were mostly kids who had been brought from outside, native kids that were separated from their families and brought here. The Tacoma Indian School actually had young people, had kids in that school that had been relocated from the Aleutian Islands. And it always just breaks my heart to think about kids who were brought, you know, all the way from the Aleutians to have to go to Indian school in Tacoma. But anyway, for Indian kids that could get out of the Indian school, the resident schools, they could go to Hawthorne, and that's the Hawthorne School. This neighborhood still had farmland in it. There were livery stables along Puyallup Avenue all the way through, so it was very much right on the port area, and the port was also, there were stockyards and the city dump and kind of all the rough stuff that was pushed out to the port were also edged onto the Hawthorne neighborhood. It kind of was, I don't know, because of the diversity of the neighborhood, because of the maritime trades, the marine connection, it was always kind of the lower end of what the city was proud of in terms of the city. But for me, it's amazing how many, when I was looking at the Hawthorne neighborhood, how many of the jobs that people had in the city directory that lived in the Hawthorne neighborhood related to the Maritimes. Bulk loading jobs that were casual jobs through the Longshoremen Union, those kinds of jobs. Today, that entire neighborhood has been taken up first in 1955 when they laid the route for I-5. The city really deliberately directed the interstate like they did in many cities. Because land was cheap, it was easy to direct the freeway, the federal system through the neighborhood. They felt like, you know, it's just poor people and that's where we're going to run the freeway. And then in the early 80s, after the freeway had been built, the remaining buildings in the Hawthorne were then targeted in the site selection committee for the Tacoma Dome picked the Hawthorne neighborhood and really the last remaining buildings. There are probably 20 or so buildings that date to 1900 in that neighborhood. So at least one notorious brothel and a few of the bars and hotels that were along there that are still there. But for the most part, the residential aspect of the Hawthorne neighborhood disappeared. And in a way, the neighborhood that was most directly associated with the port and with the activities of seaport Tacoma was in the Hawthorne neighborhood, and really kind of the last element of it vanished in the early 1980s, so it held on quite a long time. Just one last slide. By 1925, and remember, we went up to the 100,000 population, the fastest growth. For the most part, with the exception of the period from 1940 to 50, when there was a big influx of people because of wartime jobs, 1942 to 1945, which were almost all marine jobs. They were building flat-top aircraft carriers and minesweepers and ships for the war. So the port was thriving during those days. The federal government came in and took a big swatch of land away from the Puyallup tribe and created wartime housing at Salishan. The Salishan site was all Native American property that was taken to create jobs for those workers. And then the baby boom followed that. So between 1940 and 1950, we had a fairly big bump in population. With the exception of that decade, Tacoma typically has grown, and still to this day continues to grow at about 1 or 2% a year. That's kind of been our pattern. And there have been periods as recently as just 2 or 3 years ago, where we actually lost population below that 1% growth. But by 1925, because of the growth of the port and maritime, Tacoma, about 6,500 blocks, city blocks, were developed for housing, residential blocks in the city. Today, we're not quite at 8,000. So by 1925, we went all the way up to 6,500, which means that when you look at residential Tacoma, the vast majority of the houses in the city are over 100 years old. They're almost all wooden buildings. Our city by far is a wooden city, even to this day. And Tacoma largely was finished by 1925. Immigration came, that was the peak years of immigration, and typically a family moving in or an immigrant coming into the city could get to a point where they could start out in a rooming house, and by the time they had lived for 15 or 20 years, they could buy a house or build a house on their own. So this map on the right from early 1920s shows the extent of developed neighborhoods within the city. It shows how much of the city had been already built and homes, and how much that population had filled in. So in the next 90 years, it will take that time to fill in the rest of the city to get to where we are today. So it's interesting to me that where I've ended tonight is really with this 100 years ago from where we are today, and to realize how much of the city, physically and socially and economically, had already filled in and taken form by 100 years ago. That we are an elder city, as I said in the beginning. We really are an elder city, and we're working on continuing to kind of develop our story, develop the people that make up the city as it is today. And so chuckle when people want to, make some transformation of the city and correct us or somehow finish us. And we finished so much of the city, so much of it was already done 100 years ago. One last thought, and then if we have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I was going to start with Robert tonight because I wanted to end with Robert too, and just strike how quick it is to be critical of our city because the land we have built our city on somehow was, taken, stolen really, and with no sense of responsibility about our past, about what the city had been before, what the land had been before, and the people that had been here before. I think it's remarkable. I take great pride in the fact that the Puyallup people, the native people that have lived here for tens of thousands of years, we're still part of that story. We're just adding on to a story that's been in the making for thousands of years. We are an elder city, and we're just adding on, but we're not erasing what was there before. I think we still, the indigenous people, as I'm reminded all the time, are very much still here and very much active and very much a part of the diversity of the city. And most importantly, they've proven to be completely tolerant of immigrants, and that's why we are what we are. So anyway, that's all I got. John, I don't know how you want to handle this.
Well, yeah, I'll just, if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll bring the microphone around so people can hear your question.
There, John.
Okay, okay.
And I never knew that was the Hawthorne neighborhood. Number one, is the famous brothel Alfred's.
Yes.
And then number two, can you give some designation like by east-west streets? What would the Hawthorne neighborhood have consisted of?
The Hawthorne neighborhood would have gone from the port, or really Portland Avenue, all the way to McKinley Park, and on the east-west it would have been Pacific Avenue and the Puyallup River. So the Puyallup River was channelized in the 1920s. Prior to that, it meandered through near where the Cushman Hospital and where the tribal offices are. By the 1920s, because of floods and various reasons, they channelized it. So when you drive out River Road, you notice it looks man-made now. The edges are all diked on both sides, and it's absolutely straight line. Anyway, that's kind of the eastern edge of the Hawthorne neighborhood. There are a handful of houses still tucked away back behind the dome, kind of just to the north of the dome, kind of up on that rise. There's a couple of houses that are probably 1900 older houses. That area was very swampy, and there were natural springs around there, so a lot of the people that raised animals and stuff had fresh water. Anyway, but it's irregular. That's why the city didn't pave the streets or put in streetlights.
Another question?
Within the Hawthorne district, approximately where was the school located?
Actually, I did an overlap of it. It would have been underneath, well, almost exactly where the dome is, but it was a small school, so that it would be in the, if the dome is a clock and due north is 12 o'clock, it would have been between 3 and 6 in that quadrant, kind of under where the dome is today. And actually, there was kind of a swamp from where the school was behind that dropped down, and they ran the freeway over it, and then it started vertically up where McKinley Park starts. So that when you're driving on I-5 and you look at McKinley Park, where it starts up right away, that was all kind of a swamp at the foot of McKinley. And you know, I looked at some of the reports and school reports that have been done by kids at Hawthorne School, and they all talk about running around through the back trails, going to get back over to the Indian school from the Hawthorne School. Kids would go back and forth, kind of cutting through that area. And when it was raining, they'd all come home just kind of covered in mud and stuff. So, if you're 12 years old, it was probably a paradise.
Thank you, Court. Thank you, Michael, so much. This is Claire. I just a follow-up on the Hawthorne neighborhood question. Was the brewery district kind of right on the edge of the Hawthorne?
Yeah, the brewery, well, Brown and Haley actually started in the heart of it was a little square building. Mr. Brown started it, and then Haley partnered with them. But the first confectionery store was in that neighborhood, and it was not far from where Brown and Haley's is today. A little bit further east from where Brown and Haley's, where the wood Brown and Haley's building is today. But the brewery district there was one brewery that was kind of across the street from where Brown and Haley's is that 28th or whatever it is, whatever street Brown and Haley's on. Right across that street there was a brewery. It was Marinoff, who was a notorious bootlegger, and the only place we've ever had a big battle over Prohibition where guns were fired and stuff. And actually, I think there's a room for there's a painting on the wall here of Mr. Marinoff's brewery. That was in the Hawthorne neighborhood. But all the other breweries were on the other side of Pacific Avenue. Pacific, Columbia, the big breweries.
Oh, I gotta add something to the Marinoff story. So my grandfather was a boat builder at Western Boat, and the Marinoffs hired Western Boat to get them those fast bootlegging boats. And then the Coast Guard came in and hired them to build faster boats. And then Marinoff came back and built some more faster boats. I love that aspect of boat building in Tacoma at that period of time.
Can't help but win. I love the story about Scansey. You know, the Scansey family ran the ferry from Titlow Beach over to, they had 2 stops before they got to Gig Harbor. But anyway, that was, in order to get across the Narrows, that's how you had to do it. Go down the bottom of 6, get on a ferry. It would take you over across to Gig Harbor. When they started to build the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, they realized that the state had a long-term contract with Scansey to be able to operate the ferry, and when they put the bridge up, the ferry was going to be out of service, and so the Scanseys had to be compensated for that. So the Scanseys worked up a number for their losses, and what it was costing them to have this ferry boat that they couldn't use anymore. And so the state went to the till and came up with what was considered a very generous offer to the Scanseys to be able to pay them off for putting the ferry out of service, just in time for the July opening of Galloping Gertie. And 3 months later, the bridge wasn't there anymore, and they had to go back to Scansey's, and Scansey's cashed in again because they got another big contract to be able to, so.
picture on your slide when you have the map of Europe up, and it was on the lower left side. Can you tell us the slide before?
Slide before this?
Yeah. No, slide after, I guess. You went past it just before. Lower left-hand side, it had the old man and the young child coming into America, and
yeah. I'm sorry, that's kind of a maudlin photograph, but it came from the National Archives, and it was used.
yeah, that one.
Yeah, it was used as it was used on a brochure that was sent to Europe to encourage people to migrate, to immigrate to the United States. And these things were, as all tourism brochures, even to this day, were really big on graphics because it minimized the need for somebody to be able to read the printed language that happens to be on the brochure. So it's kind of a pictograph that's pretty clear what the message is. Not very complimentary of the of the immigrant folks, so they didn't characterize.
Michael, we're already working on a book on the Croatians in Washington State for Arcadia Publishing, but the rich history of our Asian communities in Tacoma, has that been considered for a publication?
No, but we should, and Lua, now that they've got the Asian Pacific Center built, that would be a great project for them to take on. We have waves of, the Samoan immigration here is really fascinating. All of our Asian, the Vietnamese immigration here after the Vietnam War is absolutely fascinating to read about. You know that California and many states refused to take immigrants from Vietnam after the fall of Saigon, and Washington, our Governor Dan Evans stood right up and said, we'll take, we were one of the states just stood up and said, we'll take immigrants from Vietnam. And look at the change they've made for the better for our state and for our economy, and just, amazing. For our city, it's just fabulous. But yeah, Mary, I agree. That would be a great project.
Well, first for immigration, we can't forget the Koreans after the Korean War, because I think Tacoma was another one of the ways it came in immigration. I'm assuming the first settlers that fishing and farming were the original things. When did timber start to take over as a driving force?
Well, timber's early because, after the California Gold Rush in 1849, everything was built out of wood and everything burned down regularly. So there was money to be made. These lumber schooners, serving San Francisco, would pay gold on the barrelhead on the beach for cut lumber. So, Mr. DeLynn, he was Danish, one of the first settlers in what is Tacoma today. The DeLynn Mill, famously one of the first sawmills here, 1851, I think, was, that's how he made a living, was cutting wood. In the days when the forest came right down to the beach, you just fall the tree right on the beach and cut it and sell it. So actually, salmon was kind of just free protein in the early days. So it took a while to get to where you could make a living in seafood, and salmon and clams and all that stuff. Good question, though. I'm not sure yet.
All right, well, I think that's it. So,
Great.
so why don't we give another big hand for Michael Sullivan?